Welcome to the Tech Humanist Show, a multimedia format program exploring how data and technology shape the human experience. I'm your host, Kate O'Neill. Trade is one of those systems that touches almost everything in our lives. And yet, for most of us, it's basically a black box until something breaks.
And in trade, it's especially pernicious and it's especially vulnerable to that kind of thing. Because a lot of these choices can be framed as like, well, we're going to do this thing and it'll be great for us and it'll hurt a bunch of foreigners. And they're far away, they're foreign, they're not with you. It doesn't matter. This is a free kick on goal. We can achieve higher employment, lower costs, national security, and the only ones who'll be upset about it are some workers in China, and maybe we don't care about them if we're not Chinese. And that is almost always wrong and almost always misleading.
And that's Dmitry Grozoubinski, author of Why Politicians Lie About Trade and What You Need to Know About It, and one of the most effective explainers of how trade actually works. He's the executive director of the Geneva Trade Platform, founder of Explain Trade, and a former Australian diplomat and trade negotiator who worked at Australia's mission to the World Trade Organization. These days he helps governments, companies, and the public make sense of the real trade-offs behind the political narratives and what all of that means for supply chains, prices, and everyday life. Dmitry Grozoubinski, it is a privilege to have you on the Tech Humanist Show. I am genuinely excited about this. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and not just replacing me with an AI trained on my voice.
I mean, we're getting there, right?
That's the dream.
Yeah, there's an awful lot that's weird about this moment, and that's one of the things. But a lot of what's weird about the moment has to do with trade, too, it seems to me. And your 2024 book now, right? Why Politicians Lie About Trade has turned out to be prescient. It's maybe even a little uncanny. It seems like, right? It's unless you sort of knew that was coming.
No, I don't think I knew that was coming. I certainly greatly appreciate the robust guerrilla marketing campaign that 2025 was for a book about trade policy and how politicians talk about it. I frankly think maybe we got a little bit too enthusiastic, might have gotten slightly carried away, and I would appreciate if the world got a little bit less exciting in trade terms. But yes, I think it was a rare moment to talk about, to try to arm people to understand what they were about to hear, and perhaps I didn't quite anticipate just how much they were about to hear it.
Right. But it seems like you did write it anticipating global trade war-like, actions. And here we are, of course. So what is the core lie or family of lies that you most wanted to expose and talk about? And why are those particular lies so sticky?
So the genesis of the book was really the sort of post-2016 moment in world politics, where simultaneously you had the Trump administration making a lot of promises about trade. And at the same time, you had Brexit, which was in the UK, put trade on the front pages. You had leaders talking about it all the time. And the key lie that I'm focused on, that I'm always focused on in trade and everywhere else, is anytime leaders are telling you that there are painless choices to make. All government is fundamentally about choosing between competing priorities. That is as true in tech as it is in trade. In trade, we might be choosing between consumers and producers, maybe. In tech, you are, any place you build some new energy infrastructure, that's somewhere a data center can go, but you've not built it in 3 other places, it can't go there. If you enable easier access for high-skilled workers from abroad, that's really good for companies that can get the best talent, but it increases competition for jobs among the local pool. And so that is a trade-off, and it can be argued in both directions. The most dangerous lies, I think, in public policy of any kind are ones where you can say, hey, here's something you can do that doesn't hurt anybody or doesn't hurt anybody you care about. And in trade, it's especially pernicious and it's especially vulnerable to that kind of thing because a lot of these choices can be framed as like, well, we're going to do this thing and it'll be great for us and it'll hurt a bunch of foreigners and they're far away, they're foreign, they're not with you. It doesn't matter. This is a free kick on goal. We can achieve higher employment, lower costs, national security, and the only ones who'll be upset about it are some workers in China, and maybe we don't care about them if we're not Chinese. And that is almost always wrong and almost always misleading, because it hurts the public because I think fundamentally, if you're evaluating your leaders, if you're trying to understand what your leaders are doing and who they are as people and as executives, either in a political or a company sense, the most important thing to understand is how are they making choices? What are their values? What's their decision-making matrix? Why did you decide that you are going to go in this direction and not this direction? And when you lie about the choices involved, you take away the ability of the public to understand who you are as a leader and how you're governing or leading them or on their behalf. And I think that's really dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really well said and explained. I appreciate that. And I'm also interested in the gap between what trade policy actually does and what people are told it does, because it seems in my own work in how technology shapes human experience, I feel like I see a similar gap around AI and data systems. Like people interact with these forces constantly, but the narratives they receive are, incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. And I wonder if you think that those two gaps in trade and tech are connected, or are they symptoms of maybe the same underlying problem at some level?
I think there's certainly symptoms of the same underlying phenomenon in that both trade and tech are black box phenomena kind of thing. And what I mean by that is that most ordinary people, most ordinary voters interact with both trade and tech at the sort of end step. I type a query into ChatGPT on my home computer. A huge amount of things happen in order to get that plain language converted, send it via internet infrastructure all the way to a server somewhere where an LLM does something magical with it, connects to the internet, does a whole bunch of other things, concocts it back into an answer and spits it back out to me. But I, as a user, all I can see is I typed a question, I got an answer. Trade in a lot of ways is very similar. We see the last step. I ordered something on Amazon, about a huge network of effects clicks in, including freight forwarders, customs valuation, ports are moving, vans are driving around, money is changing hands, taxes are being paid, and then a box arrives at my door. So in both cases, there's no reason an ordinary person would normally need to stop and think about the server infrastructure that enables a technological query. And the same as with trade. And so I think they definitely share that, and that they are massively complex processes that, for entirely understandable reasons, people are largely in the dark on. And again, where it becomes dangerous is when someone comes in and goes, oh, there's a very easy fix to this. There's a very easy fix. There's a really good example at the moment. The US decision to effectively ban routers with foreign components. At a user level, at a surface level, if you haven't really thought about the router supply chain, you're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. These things go into everything. They make the entire network run. We shouldn't be using foreign components because the average person has not spent any time unpacking the router supply chain and sort of looked at where these things are made and what's involved. It's only when they're confronted with sort of these proposals that I think it becomes active. And so I certainly think those commonalities are there.
It also seems like the confusion reaches a kind of peak right now where ordinary people are trying to follow trade news, a lot of it, tariffs, retaliations, 90-day pauses, court rulings, and finding it almost impossible to get any kind of stable read on what's actually happening or why. So what do you think people are experiencing when they try to make sense of all this? Is their confusion a bug in how we communicate trade, or is it in some sense a feature?
I don't know if bug or feature either perfectly fit. I think there's certainly an element to which, for boring political reasons that don't matter, in the West at least, there was a kind of omerata about talking too much about any of this stuff. There was a general bipartisan consensus that kind of held that more or less free trade was a positive. Both parties in most of our countries, whether that's the UK, Australia, US, Canada, what have you, were like, we would generally want more free trade. We generally want predictable free trade. We have a couple of sectors each we really want to protect, and we'll protect those, but everything else sort of will have free trade. And so it was to no one's advantage to talk about it too much, which means our muscles atrophied in terms of our ability to engage on this with the public in a way that made sense to accessibly explain it. That all went away. We were good at communicating to elites and decision makers very complicated nuances of what we were trying to do. What would be on page 37 of a trade agreement. We knew how to talk to the trade minister about that. And maybe we knew how to talk to the industries that were engaged on it about it. But we lost that ability. I don't think the same is quite true in tech, because obviously, tech people are phenomenally, or at least have agents who are phenomenally good at talking to the public and always have been. But again, were they talking to the public about how cool the new iPhone is or the prospects for AI? Or were they talking about the really hard decisions about the energy infrastructure required to support the kind of data center revolution we need to see to get within spitting distance of some of the dreams we have for AGI and so on? So I think in both cases, we forgot that sort of, we lost that muscle to the extent that we ever had it. I think there's another thing that's going on, however, and this is true, again, in both tech and trade. Governments are facing colossal challenges, really like long-standing problems. Income inequality is one of them, but we've got chronic underspend in underinvestment and misinvestment in infrastructure, education, you name it. These are huge problems with gigantic price tags and very complicated political debates to try to navigate. And by and large, governments are looking at them and going, too hard, too expensive, too long term. Mm-hmm. We can't burn all of our political capital to make a whole bunch of education investments that, best case scenario, will pay off 15 years from now when we are long out of office. We'll get removed by then. So instead, what you're seeing is a focus on like, what can we do today that looks like decisive action, even when it isn't. And both tech and trade offer those options. We will shut down trade at the borders. That looks like decisive action on manufacturing stagnation. We will shove AI into government, whether it fits or not, whether anyone's asking for it or not, whether the technology's matured or not, whether we've done the work to really integrate it or not. And that will seem like we are taking decisive action on inefficiency too. So in both cases, there's that, like, this is a problem, we must do something. This is a thing we can do, ergo we should do this problem, with both tech and trade adoption, I think.
This reminds me of how I've seen where you have described the current moment in trade as being characterized by vibes-based policy, which is, of course, both funny and genuinely unsettling. But I wonder, from your vantage point inside Geneva's trade institutions, what does it feel like to be operating in a system where Like the rules no longer seem to reliably govern outcomes.
So I think, listen, I am not hurt by the degradation of the rules as much as I think some of your listeners are,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not the one who is trying to make investment decisions
Mm-hmm.
about where to put my factory without having the certainty that it will be able to 3 years from now get what it needs or sell what it makes. So I'm getting off easy here. But I also think it's worth separating because, you talked about how I say it's vibes based.
Mm-hmm.
And vibes based is worse than a degradation of the rules based system. Because if it was just the rules falling away, but everyone was operating in very calculated, predictable ways, then I think people like your listeners, those in the C suite, those on boards, could sort of say, okay, we're going to go away and we're going to have somebody really think through, okay, this country no longer feels like it's bound by its commitments, but we know what it wants to do. We know what it wants to achieve. We know the resources it has. I can predict, therefore, what it will do next. Even if the rules won't constrain it, I know the way it will break the rules. I can predict that because I know what it wants. I know its constraints. The problem with vibes based trade policy is it's much, much harder to predict. This sort of notion that the US president sees a television commercial made by a Canadian regional government that quotes Ronald Reagan and threatens to significantly disrupt North American trade over it is not something you can fit into any kind of predictive matrix.
No.
So it's not just that those break the rules that would have. It's the fact that people are no longer operating or are increasingly reaching for vibes means that you can't even have the predictability of rational strategic thinking anymore. And I think that's doubly scary, which I'm sure really lifts the mood of this podcast. I'm sorry, Kate.
Well, and it's relevant though because it actually it brings me to something that I am developing in my current book research, which is around this kind of strangeness, and you're hitting on it exactly, the way there is a chronic uncertainty and strangeness that has settled into everyday life, and it does feel as if it's driven by, some of this vibes-based stuff you're talking about, but also the collision of technological acceleration, geopolitical instability sort of at large, and the erosion of familiar systems. And so I wonder, from where you sit, does global trade feel like a domain that is part of that weirdness? And if so, what do you see at the root of it, and besides the vibes-based thing, unless that is the core of what you see?
So it's a really interesting question. Generally speaking, and I have to put a giant asterisk over this, given what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz as we record this, and sort of the volume of disruption there. In some ways, global trade is remarkably conservative and resilient in a lot of ways. What tends to happen is even when there are disruptions, businesses will tend to find a way to keep things moving to people who want to buy them. There are cost implications. There are sometimes brief shortages. But generally speaking, what we have seen so far is that trade has been, in some ways, more resilient to the chaos than perhaps we feared. That's not a universal thing. And I should say some companies really sort of have caught it in the neck. And I think that the coming months are going to be very, very rough for a bunch of reasons. But generally speaking, trade has been more immune to this than you would think, in part because governments have mostly stuck to traditional instruments. They have messed with goods trade, and they have messed with goods trade by imposing taxes and sometimes licensing at the borders, which are at costs, they're disruptive, they add paperwork, and sometimes they make certain forms of trade not commercially viable anymore. But so far, they've kind of stuck in that traditional lane. What keeps me up at night is I'm watching an economy that is becoming a global economy that is becoming more and more digital every day,
Hmm.
where types of trade across borders that would have been unthinkable even 10 years ago are now increasingly viable to the point where, we are very close. And I think there have been examples of this where a surgeon sitting in one country can remotely control a surgery on the other side of the globe through kind of haptic feedback. That exposes an entire new class of worker to a combination of automation through AI and foreign competition in a way that we've never experienced. And if so much of the trade kind of brouhaha of the last couple of years can be traced back to a combination of automation and foreign competition putting factory workers and farmers under strain, because suddenly they had to compete with machines that mean you need far less farmers or workers to build a thing or grow a thing. And secondly, they had to compete suddenly with hyper competitive factories all around the world. We're now moving to a spot where accountants have to worry about that. HR professionals, like artists, have to worry about it in ways that they maybe never had to before. And so what keeps me up at night is we have seen the scale of the backlash to the so-called China shock, to the sort of pressure on manufacturing. What happens when governments start reaching for a broader set of tools to try to fight back against job losses in the much, much, much larger services sector? And there is absolutely no guarantee that they will do so in ways that are thoughtful, rational, proportional, and not, in fact, quite vibes based. And that really scares me, because sometimes it can feel that tech is invincible, but as we've recently discovered, a lot of these systems are a lot more fragile than than they can seem. Maybe if I give one example,
Yeah.
so something that is very much in vogue right now is business process outsourcing. So I have a very large company with a huge payroll department,
Hmm.
and I find a company in, for example, India
Hmm.
that has really qualified accountants with a much lower cost of living, much lower wage expenses, and a lot of expertise at doing payroll. And I say, okay, my payroll is now going to be outsourced to that company. In the same way that I used to outsource manufacturing a plastic widget that I don't want to make in my own country, I now outsource that process. On the one hand, it's an efficiency gain, win-win. On the other hand, if a government wanted to intervene in that, all they would have to do is make it illegal to move personnel financial data overseas or store it overseas. They can do that with the stroke of a pen. And, they can't physically stop you sending an email, but they can put in place a rule that says if you're caught doing it, or if you're audited and found to be doing it, there will be massive fines and potentially, personal liability for board members or C-suite executives, at which point I promise you, McKinsey's not doing that anymore. So at the stroke of a pen, they could they could completely invalidate that entire business model, throw a massive amount of disruption into that sort of form of technology, and so on. So this is the kind of thing where, I don't have any position on whether governments should do this at all, or whether governments should think through whether they should protect local accounting workers. That's a choice. You can argue that in lots of different directions. What terrifies me is that they will do so quickly, performatively, without industry consultation, without thinking through the third order effects, and way too fast to manage the disruption in business processes. That's what scares me.
Yeah, that's a vivid example, and one that I'm sure hits home for a lot of our listeners. I'm also noticing and thinking about how, data and algorithms are increasingly mediating trade decisions, like how firms are managing their inventory, their logistics, how governments model the effects of tariffs. And so I'm wondering, given everything you're describing, about what we've just been talking about, but also the opacity already built into these systems. Does that computational layer make things more legible, or does it add yet another layer that most people have no way to see into or question?
That's a really good question. I think trade involves a huge amount of data that can be quite hard to pass. And I think something that AI tools are phenomenal at is making sense of large data sets and amalgamating them and looking for outliers they can flag for humans in a way that would be really difficult, really cost intensive. So I think what it's allowing people to do is it's not that it's illuminating data that wasn't there before, but it is giving a lot more people, especially people without the huge resource backing of, say, a government or the New York Times, the ability to say, well, I really want to look at, I'm really interested in sanctions evasion by companies selling into Russia. And what I want to do is, I've got this trade data for the whole world. What I want to do is analyze this data and find spikes, outliers. I want to see where suddenly imports into Russia spiked for no apparent reason, and where that might correspond with, suddenly Azerbaijan is selling 4,000% more Maseratis. Who's selling them Maseratis? And how do we trace that back? And what are the conclusions we can draw? So I think it's giving people a lot more tools to go dive deep into that data and learn things beyond just the absolute headline numbers of, world trade went up by 2%, world wheat prices are down by 3%. So I think that is really cool. And that empowers especially a new generation of independent Substack journalists, economics bloggers, and so on, to highlight things that otherwise would have languished until a PhD researcher decided to devote 4 years of her life to going through the data manually, or in R or something, to uncover it, or a really big institution decided to shine a light on it. So I think it is doing that. On the other hand, and I say this as somebody who kind of wrote the book on it, I do think sometimes it's worth talking, when we're talking about the public, how much appetite does the general public have for a huge amount of data-driven conversations, for getting into the weeds of many of these things. I think often the public is looking for a general understanding and some signals about who are you fighting for, what are you trying to do, what's the broad shape you're making. And there, I don't think AI is going to save us.
Yeah, it is. I think people are living by vibes as much as we are governing by vibes, right? Very much.
It's vibes all around.
Vibes all the way around. What it's interesting too. I think going back to, you were talking about supply chain earlier, and the notion of like the current volatility there. But one of the things that strikes me about supply chains in this conversation is how invisible they are until they break. And it seems like during COVID is a phenomenal example of this, where people suddenly discovered that, things that they assumed were simple, like finding baby formula or a specific car part or a particular medication, those were actually the endpoints of extraordinarily complex global systems, as you so eloquently explained earlier. But what is it that had to be true about how we built those systems for that invisibility to have been so complete?
I mean, first let me say, I think this is everywhere. There's that very famous, I think it's like an XKCD comic, where the entire internet is sort of resting on one 57-year-old guy updating a GitHub, a single Git, and that's the only thing that is keeping the entire system afloat and everything. So I think this is true of a lot of things.
Too real.
Yeah, that's we're all hoping that guy is doing some weight training and eating well,
Yes.
because otherwise we might be in some trouble.
I send him a green smoothie every day virtually.
Exactly. But I think, if we're wondering what had to happen, the simple answer is that one thing that capitalism is phenomenally good at is incentivizing people with coming up with ways of turning around to others and saying, here's this annoying thing you do, I can take it off your hands. And so, a really good example, a very good friend of mine, her name is Dr. Anna Jazuska. She's a customs expert. And we were talking about customs, and she knows it far, far better than I could ever hope to. And I was sort of talking about filling in forms. And she goes, well, like nobody actually fills in forms. Like if you're trying to ship a box, very unlikely you yourself will ever see a form because there are these other actors. There's freight forwarders, there's sort of customs consultants, and basically you pay them. And so we've evolved this entire infrastructure to hide all of that nonsense. One of the many reasons Amazon is so successful is this facilitated by Amazon process, where if you are a small merchant, you are making hats, Amazon turns to you and goes, you don't have to deal with customs, you don't have to deal with anything. We'll do all of that for you. We will facilitate it by Amazon. You just make your hats, we will sell your hats, we will take your hats from where they are to where they need to go. We will do all of that. So we have created incentives for people to hide all of this stuff for us. But we've also created, I think, path of least resistance dependency, because everyone's looking to optimize, everyone's looking to cut costs where they can, and there has not been a lot of incentives necessarily to build in a huge amount of redundancy or resilience. There's a common action problem, but there's generally it works. To go back to that tech example, that guy's Git is working, and it would cost $1 bazillion to replace it. And why should I replace it? It's working. Why would I pay to replace it and everyone else is going to free ride on me? And so a really good example of that is during COVID, you're mentioning some of the shortages. One of the things that happened is that it turned out that we had only enough shipping containers to move stuff around, provided it kept moving around in predictable ways. As soon as consumption patterns abruptly changed, all of our boxes that other boxes go into ended up in the wrong places. And so there were shipments sitting in ports that couldn't leave them because there were no containers to load them into, because we only had enough containers for what we needed. Nobody was like, I'm going to buy a giant warehouse and stock 1 million extra shipping containers just in case one day there's a global pandemic and China stops buying stuff and we'll suddenly need to move a whole bunch of boxes that should be in China to somewhere else. Nobody was doing that because there was no incentive to do that. And so I think this is how we get to this fragility, where everyone is incentivized to do the bare minimum required. Everyone's incentivized to do what works. And especially until recently, boards of most companies were not asking about geopolitical risk, for example. Boards were not following international trade policy particularly closely. Some select companies that were exposed were, but your board wouldn't have thanked you for, drawing down your margins by 10% in order to build in extra resilience for geopolitics. Maybe they will now. But perhaps 10 years ago, most companies weren't necessarily thinking that way. And I think that's how we got here, and not just in trade.
Yeah, and the current tariff environment seems like it now introduces a new kind of volatility into the already complex systems you're describing. I have a question for you about the tariff premise that was introduced by Trump in the State of the Union, the idea that it could substantially replace income tax. And when I heard that, I was like, I'm interviewing Dmitry. I'm going to ask him about this. What is the premise? When political leaders say tariffs are paid by foreign countries, what's the simplest, accurate way to explain who actually bears the cost and under what conditions that's true?
Sure. So first of all, to answer the question of can import taxes, can tariffs replace income tax?
Right.
You don't really need to interview a trade expert. You can interview someone with 7th grade arithmetic. You can look up what U.S. income tax revenue was last year, and you can sort of look at what the total value of US imports were last year, and you can compare the two numbers. And in order to replace income tax with tariffs, you'd have to tariff every product at something like 100%. And you need to do that in some magical way where even though you were charging double for everything from overseas, people kept buying it at the exact same rate. And like the math just doesn't math, as the kids would say. So, I mean, but let's kind of set that aside. The way that tariffs work in practice, like literally what happens, is they are paid by the importer. So they are a tax on bringing something into the country. But what practically happens when you introduce a tariff? So you now say, we are going to charge you 10% of the at border value when you bring a melon into the US. Now, what happens next is almost certainly a negotiation between buyer and seller. If the seller in a foreign country, if the producer has a huge margin and they're really worried about being outcompeted by a local firm, let's say in the US, or they're really worried that people will just stop buying their product, they might say, we're willing to eat some of this. We're willing to offset it by lowering our prices. So at the end of the day, the importer will pay some of the tariff, but the prices on the shelf to the consumer will remain the same. That is, we now have the data, we've now seen what happens. That is the absolute exception. That very, very rarely happens. Your listeners will know, I don't know how many of you are in export. How many of you have a 15% profit margin you can comfortably hand over on every product without it rendering you non-competitive or loss-making? I would imagine not too many of you. So what actually happens is the sellers say, well, that's your problem, and the buyers pay the tariff. And then what do the buyers do? They pass it on to consumers. So in practice, it's just, I mean, we can talk around it in circles for 1,000 years. It is a tax on Americans for choosing to buy foreign things. That is what it is. You can get into the mechanics of it. Nothing else matters. It is a particular kind of tax. You don't have to have any moral judgments around that. You don't have to get sort of preachy about it. It's just another kind of tax.
Right. Right. Well, I think you really well said, that it would have to be 100% tariffs, and it would have to be mean that the consumption would remain at the same level. But what second order effects would then, given the tariff rate of 100%, what second order effects could we expect in a situation like that?
Oh God, I mean 100% tariffs, because you'd have to charge them on almost everything. So you charge 100% tariff on everything. Second order effect, first of all, is everything becomes twice as expensive to import.
Sure.
Logically. And that's really, it's a really regressive measure. Because if you were paying a lot of income tax before, and suddenly you're not paying any, well, you now have a bit more money to spend. Maybe you just eat that. You're like, okay, well, French champagne now costs twice as much, but on the other hand, I'm no longer paying 34% on the upper tranche of my income. Cool, I can afford more champagne. Très bien. The less wealthy you are, the less that math works. Mm-hmm. To the point where if you are a person sort of close to minimum wage, you're likely paying very little income tax to begin with, but you eat the same number of potatoes. The wealthy consume more expensive food, perhaps, but they don't consume significantly more food than the average American. So it really hits sort of the lower 3/4 of Americans a lot harder, decreases their consumption. It is also an absolute body blow to all US manufacturing and, frankly, all US business. If everything that you get from overseas, you become instantly less competitive than you are Ford. You are trying to compete with Opel in Europe. but they can get the Chinese parts they need at a 10% tariff markup or less, you're paying double for every part. That inevitably drives up your costs, and it drives up your costs, especially overseas. So immediately you have that effect. And then the next order effect is if you tariff everybody at 100%, countries will retaliate. Mm-hmm. Because countries will sort of say their own public, whether it even makes sense or not, their public will interpret it as an attempt to hurt them, as an affront, as a whatever. And like we saw with China, you will see countries start locking out American production. So now you have US companies that are less competitive because they can't get what they need, and less competitive because they can't sell what they make. And neither of that, I think, is particularly good for everybody, especially if it's not just confined to tariffs. Because let me tell you, if I am sitting in Europe, I have some options for hurting US manufacturing. But if I really want to make the US feel pain, maybe I start looking at what can I do to hurt Microsoft's bottom line? How can I make Nvidia feel the pain? They can read the strengths of the American economy too, and so it starts a potential kind of arms race or pain exchange race that doesn't end well for anybody.
Yeah, thank you for walking through those steps. I think the clarity is really helpful for folks to kind of get at that level. You, of course, have built your career, it seems, on making trade legible to people who aren't trade experts, negotiators, corporate officers, members of parliament, and now through your book, general readers. I'm wondering, given everything, as we approach kind of the end of this discussion, given everything we've discussed about institutional fragility and political incentives to keep people confused, does public understanding actually change outcomes in your view? Does an informed citizenry move the needle?
I think it can. It doesn't always, but it certainly can. Because I think it makes it harder to sell them snake oil. I think, when it makes it harder for you as a leader, as a potential leader, as a candidate, as a political party, to say, I have the magical solution, and here it is. I do not think the next US presidential election will see a party promising that they can fix US manufacturing through tariffs. I think now that the public has well and truly, now it wasn't wildly popular before the election, but now I think that the public has well and truly seen how that's played out. And now that public understanding has significantly improved, the ability to reach for that talking point, at least for a while, it's 2026, everyone has a memory of about 4 minutes. We may well be back here, have me on your show 8 years from now when we might be having this conversation again, wistfully promising that in 2032, no one will dare mention tariffs. But for now, I think it's clear that improved public understanding, whether that's through clear communication or, as in this case, having to see it, like having to feel it, having to watch bananas and coffee rise in price, looking at their supermarket total at the end of a day and not seeing factories surge back, not seeing the US deficit substantially shrink, in fact seeing it increase. All of those things take away the ability to do costless vibes-based campaigning. Right. And that is to the good.
That's excellent. Hey, one last thing, if you can spare me a minute, I just want to ask you what I love to ask as a closing question of my guests, which is just, what's giving you hope right now? Not naive optimism, but, sort of genuine grounded hope in the world of trade and geopolitics institutions that suggest to you that the strangeness of this moment might eventually resolve into something better.
This is incredibly niche and geeky, but the absolute astronomical rise of renewable energy and battery technology, even in the face of policy skepticism and leaders that are downright hostile to it. The Trump administration is having to pay out like $1 billion to get people to stop building wind turbines. because the adoption rate is unstoppable, the innovation rate is unstoppable. And while, there's no cause for complacency, and there's no sort of, I'm not one of these people who just thinks we can sit back and wait for some combination of, Shenzhen and Silicon Valley to save us. I am so incredibly buoyed by the possibilities and the pace of progress and innovation, because gosh, if we can solve the energy problem, then it doesn't mean we're out of the woods, but God, do we have a map and a much brighter torch. And that gives me a lot of hope.
Well, that's fantastic. Dmitry Grozoubinski, thank you so much for spending this time with us and giving us a glimmer of an education toward why politicians lie about trade and everything else that you've spoken about. Where can people find out more about your work?
So I have a website called explaintrade.com, which sort of has my occasional musings. I post on Blue Sky at explaintrade.com. And of course, I am on LinkedIn and very easy to find because I am the only human being on Earth with this name.
You are very lucky. I'm one of lots and lots of Kate O'Neills out there. Very, very lovely to speak with you, Dmitry. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Tech Humanist Show. This episode was produced and edited by Thrive Loud Productions, with research by Ashley Robinson and Aaron Daughtry of Interabang. You can find more information about the show's guests and links to their projects at thetechhumanist.com, where you can also find more episodes, or you can subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks to all of our guests for lending their voices to help make the future a brighter place. I'm Kate O'Neill. You've been listening to The Tech Humanist Show from KO Insights.